Welcome to Size of Thoughts. My name is Jacob Klicklick. I'm the producer of the show. Things you'll hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So thanks for tuning in tonight. Joining me for this time is returning guest John Terry.
Hello. Thanks for. Oh, does this sound right? Okay, that sounds right. All right. Yep. Thanks for having me back on, Jacob.
And also, we'll be expect joining us within the next few minutes is returning guest Michael Gonzalez. Now, currently is the first week of classes back. I believe we're just returning from one of the 4 to 6:40 seminars. Mm-hmm. I guess navigating around that should make this scheduling just a little more interesting. But for tonight, going to be talking about the Black Panther Party. I guess in part it's a matter of following up on sort of threat from last week, in terms of it seemed like it was overly too optimistic or talking co-ops. But also just taking advantage of the fellow grad students who have studied this and working to try to contextualize the Panthers and try to figure out how to what extent sort of common story with other civil rights movements in the context of 60s radicalism, in militancy, in the left, any number of labels that might wish to join to it. So I guess, first question, John, I guess just how much were the Black Panther Party, some off on their own, in terms of separate of it, are they, or do they have more links with, sort of quote unquote more mainstream and friendly counterculture group?
Well, that's it's sort of a tough question. That's kind of the nature of the beast, what we're talking about here. They're a group that obviously, I guess maybe not obviously, maybe that's something we should talk about too, that scared off the more mainstream. So if we're going to call maybe SCLC, Martin Luther King, I'm sure that most people are familiar with those. If we're going to call those NAACP, if we're going to call those mainstream organizations, I would say that obviously the Panthers had, they scared off some of those people, but that's not unlike SNCC and CORE as well, who also sort of, because of their tactics and the way that they approach this, also kind of frightened off. And really, the key is, when frightening off those groups, right, you lose access to an organized infrastructure, liberal politicians, things like that. So, but there's also linkages there. So, and this is what I always, usually this is framed up as like a choice. You have like your choice between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King or something, right? And I think that that's really unfair, because the same kind of people who might go to a Black Panther meeting might be the same kind of person who supports Martin Luther King. So in terms of the groups, there would probably be as many problems as cooperation, but I think there'd also be a recognition that everyone on some level is on the same team, but then just like any other human organization, some of the people hated each other, right? And there's a lot of people who didn't necessarily officially subscribe to either view and would sort of go between. So I think, in terms of as an organization, they would definitely be disassociated from some of the things that we'd call the mainstream. And really, their biggest problem was they were disassociated from rich liberal white folks who could give them money, but in terms of, the actual people who made up the organization, these are people who would go in and out of various different kinds of organizations. And Mike is here, and he can add to that as well, I think.
Yeah, the question is partly, setting up, figuring out what the Black Panther Party was connected with, or like how much, even is reasonable to talk about it as its own thing, or how much in relation to other things. Since, I guess John's offered a useful corrective to the view, which seems to come up in, different forms. On the one hand, in terms of people look back on, you had, in terms of Martin Luther King, who becomes virtually made as a saint, now. But then there's sort of the extremists that were meeting hate with hate, etc. But they also sometimes have a tendency within radical community to just point at in terms of King and others as ineffective reformists and just idealize Panthers just because they are more and more militant, and certainly more militant in rhetoric and in some of ideology. So I guess John's offered the view that to some extent that doesn't necessarily work as the same as breakthrough.
So I'm glad to be here, and sorry for being tardy. Got here as fast as I could. I'm still panting a little bit from the bike ride, so pardon me if I seem a little out of breath. But I just caught the tail end of what you were saying there, John, and it reminded me, maybe I understood it, I hope I understood it correctly, but it reminded me of something that I saw in I think it was Eyes on the Prize, one of the volumes of Eyes on the Prize, the very famous documentary about civil rights movement, and also talks about the Black Power and the Black Panther movement. And a quote from a woman whose name escapes me, but she was an elderly woman, and she kind of summed up, I think, what a lot of people who were involved in the civil rights movement felt about the Black Panthers. It wasn't that they disagreed with the goals per se. They might have thought, they're not doing it right, but the end goal, the objectives of the Black Panthers, the objectives of a lot of the more so-called militant organizations that arose at the tail end of the 60s were not necessarily all that radical, or I should say radically different from the objectives that a lot of the hardcore activists who were involved in what you might call the civil rights movement. It wasn't really all that different. Now, of course, the civil rights movement often gets framed in terms of focusing specifically on certain sort of civil rights, for lack of a better word here, whereas the more militant tail end of the 60s movement was maybe more encompassing of larger change, the totality of change. But I think it's a very important point, if I understand your point that you're making, that it's not that the Black Panthers necessarily were viewed as wanting something all that different than what African American activists had always wanted, which was power in their lives and the ability to just really have more control over the situation that they're living in. So I don't know if that answers the question at all, just kind of coming in at the tail end here.
I think it does, and it also provides a useful bridging point too. I mean, talking more directly about what they wanted, and also what the organization was able to deliver, them mobilize to bring people in with it. I mean, what were sort of immediate objectives, immediate accomplishments, and also just contextualize a little bit more for audience in terms of what areas and time period we're talking about.
Well, if we're talking about the Black Panthers specifically, it's interesting that. If we're talking about the early Black Panther Party, it seems that there's a shift throughout, or many shifts throughout the history of the Black Panthers. But the early Black Panthers was in 1966, I want to say, when they drew up the 10-point platform, and the name of the Black Panther Party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, if I got the name right, something like that. And one of the immediate aims was, it was a very specific local issue, which was police, well, not to say the police brutality was specific to Oakland, but they were dealing with some very specific issues in Oakland with police brutality. And the aim was, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was that African American activists were going to arm themselves and defend their communities against the as Bobby Seale would say, the racist pig power structure, and as was manifested in the police force, the Oakland police force. And now this obviously was something that was very, could be generalized across the United States, because this was of course not unique to Oakland. And, but if you want to talk about throughout the Black Panther Party, they shift in many ways to being much more ideological later on. I don't know if you wanted to, before we get into that, if you wanted to, John, if
I would
wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's an important distinction, and that's always something that activists have to be aware of, right? Like, what exactly does pragmatism mean when police are shooting people in your neighborhood, right? That it's a really sort of different way to. I feel like even within the 10 points, some goals are more ideological in nature, I think, and then some are much more immediate and practical. So you've got a group that is patrolling police officers, following them around with guns, making sure that they're not violent. You also have a group that is providing breakfast, right? So they're saying, all right, we need to make sure that our kids are fed before they go to school. But then you also have a group that's calling for, all right, we want every black prisoner out of prison right now is one of the points. Redistribution of land and resources immediately, which to me, I like, and this is always sort of I think that I like the fact that they had the sort of ideology that they had. I mean, they become a parody, right? It only you just see the black guy with the leather jacket and the shotgun in any movie or something like that. They become these pop cultural kind of clowns unto themselves. So it erases a lot of actually what they were thinking about and saying. So I think that they have really they have specific, practical, very pragmatic issues that they're facing in their immediate communities. And we know that the Panthers were nationwide, but very, some chapters would hate other chapters, right? And they had very different ideas on what they should be doing. And so it's really localized. And, for one group, it might be police brutality. For another group, it might be more important to, get a YMCA open or something like that, which I think also speaks to sort of what Mike's talking about, this idea of power as maybe something more than like the right to vote, like the actual right to have some say in the things that you're going to do in your daily life and to give yourself a decent sort of opportunity to have, I guess, that kind of good life. So really, what they wanted, some of the things I think were just, very practical, the things that almost any other black activist from then, from before, and to the present wants. And then, I think that they, and as Mike said too, this is a group that's constantly changing, shifting, the emphasis can be more on rhetoric and ideology, and in other cases the emphasis could be on actually like let's go to this place and protest. So they really do a lot of different things, and I mean we can sort of talk about how that developed, but yeah, I think it's to think about them you really have to think of that constant mix, which might sound contradictory but was never really, I don't think, a contradiction to them, because they would say you'd have to have the ideology to properly frame and contextualize the practical things. You need to think about ideology.
But the ideology changed over time,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
like if you look at the 10 points, the early Black Panther Party, it just really, it does seem to have a lot more of a sort of like black nationalist tinge to it. And if you think about the early influences, Bobby Seale's quote, I've seen him say that, one of the really early influences on him was Malcolm X, who, of course, in the later years in his life, overtly described his politics as black nationalist. And one of the things that he worked on was trying to get the United Nations to kind of to I forget the exact wording, a plebiscite within the United Nations, something like that. It's one of the 10 points, so one of the points in the 10-point platform, to actually recognize the black people in the United States as a nation, sort of within a nation, an oppressed nation living within the United States as a larger nation, and so it's really, in a lot of ways you got this sort of black nationalist ideology, but as time goes on, they become much more overtly Marxist and really kind of Maoist in their outlook, and for various reasons, and I'm not sure exactly where the Maoist influence comes from, but I do know that by the late 60s they're selling Mao's Little Red Book to raise money, and they're not calling themselves black nationalists, they're calling themselves black intercommunalists, and they're just like actually rejecting the very term black nationalist, whereas Bobby Seale saying that when Malcolm X died, him and Huey decided that they were going to start an organization that put Malcolm X's ideas into practice. And so his ideas, what were his ideas? As black nationalist, as he described it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting overall trajectory tracing out. I mean, particularly the notion of ideology in some ways second. I mean, it's built in. And just organizing against police, I mean, it is immediately practical. But because in terms of they have the broader veneer of legitimacy, there you do need to articulate some kind of philosophy at that point, or at least perspective of why opposing it. But I guess it would make sense that in some ways the successful movement, I mean, would have a lot of the diversity or even what we call like fragmentation or internal contradictions, that a hostile critic would call it. Just if it actually is a sort of community-involved, participatory center that's going to shift in terms of what's of the most concern with membership. I guess also, I mean, with the turn towards ideology at the point when, in terms of mass rallies of everyone holding up Little Red Book and other things of it. I mean, I guess, to put a sort of overly crude question, like, does that pay off, or to what extent does that work?
Just marginalizes them more.
Does it benefit, or what are a broader way, perhaps, of asking, like, what are other like changes and like growth and in terms of solidarity and fragmentation among the movement. that happening more during this period. I mean, it's not. It's not kind of just be in terms of if they thought they were then. They decided to model themselves after Maoists and therefore replicated the same things that were happening in China at the same period. But I guess immensely complicated picture here that I'm asking to kind of just like sort of summarize. But in terms of overall, if there's an earlier and kind of more, it's all 10 points, more sort of Malcolm X influenced Black nationalist one, and then sort of a more Maoist phase, or
it's a good question. They had the fractures within their organization. There was a lot of stressors going on, so it's hard to pinpoint what's leading to that, and so I'll just I'll leave it at that for as far as the fractures. There was a lot of different stressors going on. How they shifted to the sort of more ideological. I guess I would say that the 10 points were specifically meant to be something that would be easily communicated to anybody. It was meant to be not a political treatise. It was meant to not be a sociological analysis. It was meant to be something that could be communicated to anybody. And then the shift towards a more ideological founding, I don't really, maybe John, you have a better understanding of how that comes about. I just know that it does come about. And I know, Jacob, you're talking about, well, maybe it's having a participatory sort of like bottom-up organization. Well, I don't really know that was happening either, right? They were very centralized, and that was one of the major causes of the stressors, was that you have this central sort of leadership that they start turning on each other, and so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's any group that starts to coalesce around certain personalities. I mean, that's definitely going to be a problem, right? Like, it's why, nobody knows who Ella Baker is, right? But, like, people might know, like my students might not know who she is, but they'll know who SNCC is because she says, well, it's more about the organization, it's more about the group, it's more about what you're actually going to do. I mean, I feel like part of the shift is a different assessment of successes and failure, right? Like, I mean, obviously, it's sort of like a kind of internal politics. The group that can seem to produce successes, right, is going to be the group that's going to probably attract a broader audience. And so, you have the Martin Luther Kings of the world who seem to be producing, and then, Stokely Carmichael, maybe even more so, producing things that look like successes, right? So it's like on this piece of paper, it says now that we're going to get to vote, and we'll get to vote. And, not too long after that, like, okay, we'll have a black mayor. Well, if you just, if there's ways to minimize all of these successes, well, then people have to start to rethink, like, okay, so, well, we've got a black politician now, but that actually didn't improve any of the conditions here, right? And then there's some places, that are getting worse. The farther away you get from the post-World War II boom, if it's, young black men are the first people to go, right, from a lot of these jobs. So you've got, a group that on some level can appeal to young, frustrated, can appeal to anger and attempt to sort of channel it. But I feel like some of the shifts in ideology would have to do a little bit with, just this larger idea of black power, thinking like this thing that a white power structure is going to give you on paper, that's maybe not, that might not only not be a success, that could be something that might even be worse.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, and that especially that you mentioned the mayor, getting what I know less about is the Black Panther Party in the 70s, the decline of the Black Panther Party. But it is interesting that it seems like in the 70s they actually become less ideological in a sense, and you actually have Bobby's lesser known activities of the Black Panther Party. You have Bobby Seale running for mayor of Oakland in 72, 73, something like that. This was before the schism where is he kicked out or he leaves. There's rumors that he was beat up. He denies it. So I don't really know what happened there, but there he was running for mayor. And yet, they're in the late 60s calling themselves communists and Maoists, and kind of rejecting that sort of traditional representative politics.
And I think there's something that I think is fine about that. Like, the hallmark of a good group would be somebody that's willing to adapt. And there's a great article I'd have to give credit to Dawson Barrett out there if he's listening, showing me this, the Black Flag of Anarchy. And, the author is going and looking at these groups, right? College kids. And what do they do? Like, we're anarchists, and these are the people that can make up our cadre. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you can't be a communist and an anarchist at the same time. But what the group was doing was they were picking and choosing the certain things that seemed to make sense for them. So they'd take snippets of ideology, snippets of practical experience, things like that. So, you've got a Maoist communist anarchist, who's seeking out office, right? Like these things that just seem extremely contradictory, but in a sense, the game is so rigged against these groups and the power structure is so firmly in place that I think that, these kind of contradictions are really, they're more reflective of things that are going on outside than, some sort of necessarily like a failure or somebody saying this didn't work and that didn't work. A lot of groups are just trying to, let's try and get somebody in office, or let's say screw getting someone in office, let's try and get bread into the homes, or something like that.
And I guess what also just complicates any kind of assessment of the movement even more is to the extent that FBI infiltration and disruption. I mean, it seems to have figured out fairly sort of accurately that if people are starting to dismantly mobilize against and fight back against the police, I mean, sure, you could bring in army and you bring in heavier weapons, but how much more effective to get every bit of informant to just attempt not to infiltrate it, just to increase divisions and and make contradictions of it less workable. So I mean, so this is one of like the first most I guess at this scale in terms of the amount of resources that FBI focus at this group specifically. I mean, it had other ones operating across the 60s, but. Am I correct that there's a kind of a level of just complexity by the state and just the number of agents that are just involved full time in figuring out.
We may still be finding out of more agents.
Apparently. Wasn't the book Subversives? Wasn't there the claim recently that
Richard Aoki, famous Japanese American Black Panther member, early supplier of guns to the Black Panthers, may have been an agent at least early on for working for the FBI. That claim is contested. I haven't read the book that accuses him, and I hadn't really heard much about Richard Aoki before this controversy. So I should probably just not comment on the veracity of the claim.
Yeah.
But suggest that either way, some of the things are riddled enough and complex enough that are still uncovering at this point. But I guess either a genuine case of
there's been plenty of validated claims.
Or again the other level of it, that take a sort of well-respected in terms of things that's seen as militant activists, and then imply or directly state is working as a way of trying to.
The leaders called each other, at different times. You have sort of like the three most well-known activists in the Black Panther Party: Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver, and the sort of what we call the snitch jacketing. The FBI was so successful in sowing this sort of distrust that they all thought each other were FBI agents at one point, and they're accusing each other of being FBI agents, and so you don't really need to militarily. Well, they sure did militarily attack the Black Panthers, but you don't solely need to do that.
Yeah, and it's shootouts are bad publicity unless people say, oh, it's those Panthers, at it again. Like, of course they're going to get shot at, right? They carry guns around and they agitate police officers, right? Like the level of the sale. And I think, COINTELPRO is still something, we're still learning about it, right? I mean, it's just thousands and thousands of pages of documents. I actually saw, like, the size of Liberace and Reggie White's files, right? Like, the FBI is insane. They really are there. They are keeping tabs on people. And, I mean, from Hoover's perspective, I don't think that it's necessarily so much, I like to think like, hey, wherever there's like an anti-miscegenation law, that means, people are, miscegenation's going, like, you don't make the law, you don't go after this group unless they're a genuine threat. But I feel like on some level they represented a far, I mean, obviously I would almost say, they are way more of an ideological threat to the established order to say, like, the police are actually the enemy. The police are doing bad things to you. They're the people you have to watch out for. The politicians are the people who are doing bad things to you. And so, what way to disrupt that? You can use violence where it seems like you'll get away with it, right? And, they were really good at getting away with it, right? A hail of bullets at Freddie Hampton, maybe somebody shot back, and, the cops walk out smiling, carrying out a dead body, and nobody was prosecuted. This is a very high-profile case in the middle of Black Chicago, like they were getting away with things that were, ridiculous, and these things still happen, right? You hear the Somali immigrant like shot like 90 times, like this kind of crazy stuff happens. So you can use that to your advantage. Also, get the group to break up, and then you have this sort of like two-pronged attack. One, their ideology looks unsound because we've made them look crazy, even to each other, so no one can stand each other, no one can trust each other, no one will even talk about anything. People can't be in the same room together. So you break them down, break down the ideology, and then you also just sort of actually get the group to physically disband. And then another thing that's there too is drugs too, and increasing unemployment, right? Like the situation gets more desperate, right? All the way through the 80s, right? So this is, many things that are working against this group, and I feel like that's, to me it's a sign of FBI capitalizing on that and exacerbating it more than like actually seeing them as a legitimate threat or something like that.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, how much did the Panthers matter, or how much did they accomplish on? Things more broadly, but I guess within Oakland, specifically. It seems to be remain throughout the site of their largest operations and largest presence.
Well, it's a great question. What did they accomplish, right? Their organization effectively by the early 70s was on the decline. By the mid 70s was just minuscule, and then by whatever time they disbanded, I think it was almost 1980. It wasn't quite that. But they were effectively neutralized as an organization. But one could argue that they had a profound impact culturally, that they had a profound impact on just the sort of the way of as part of the I hate to use the term Black Power, and they've shied away from using the term Black Power because I'm not really quite sure what it means still at this point. But nonetheless, the idea of pride and standing up for yourselves and being black and proud, and I know that James Brown is famous for that one, but the Black Panthers were right there with that sort of cultural shift. So, maybe we could talk about more their impact culturally. I don't know. Politically, that's up for debate.
Yeah, I definitely think that the rhetorical style, it's just like, Forrest Gump, right? You're going to get the Black Panther character in there, right? They've become such a easy pop cultural go-to, I guess. It's very easy to just say, oh, here is late 60s, early 70s black radical. All you need, if you say you're making a movie, you just need an afro, a beret, sunglasses, black leather jacket, and it instantly calls this image to people's mind, right? It's like that you're indicating Black Power versus, and it means militancy, and it doesn't mean Martin Luther King, right? Like, you can just, a snap of your fingers, use that. So they definitely, their rhetorical stance, right, is then you've got guys like James Brown. At the same time, you have tons of jazz musicians. You have a lot of people who are definitely, and to think about, what the actual on piece of paper sort of gains are, right? But, I think that a lot of people have given that up and said, you know what, look at what happens to funk and soul and hip hop at this time. This is the first time that you actually also, maybe even ironically, you start to get really big time crossover black audiences, black and white black performers with a huge crossover audience. So you have the Temptations and stuff like that, right? Which all little white kids grow up listening to that stuff too. You've got Muhammad Ali. I think that there's this whole new group of people, and maybe you can't really give the Panthers credit for that, but that was definitely that style, that attitude, certainly a profound impact.
And sorry to cut you off here. I'm just going to say one thing to that, is that a lot of those activists, those Black Panther activists, become, maybe they drift away from the party. We know that the party is, the membership declines just precipitously in the 1970s, but those individual activists go on to be so important in other realms, including becoming, I know there's the story of Huey is pretty sad because he ends up in not such a great situation, but some other of these other activists become college professors, Kathleen Cleaver. And then thinking about funk, there's a lesser known Niles Rodgers, who is a very famous music producer for a lot of mainstream stuff now, like producing Madonna and just like a bunch of mainstream stuff. He was a very active producer in the 1970s. There's the song "We Are Family" by is it Sister Sledge? Is that who does that? And people don't know that he wrote that song, and he was a Black Panther. And just like how you have all of these people who they grow from these experiences. If they don't die, I mean, there was some 30 Black Panthers who were killed in shootouts, and there was a lot of other people who, maybe along the way they had to, after the Black Panther Party, after they left, they maybe had to go through some hard times. I know Nile Rodgers ended up having, drug addiction, and Jamal Joseph, who is not very well known, but I saw a documentary about him. He leads this youth group out in New York that I saw recently. They were singing on the Academy Awards. They had a song, and it was like, I see Jamal Joseph. Here's a former Black Panther who I know went through the drug phase and the prison phase, but nonetheless, the experiences that these individuals had, that the growth that they had individually, they were propelled to do other major things that maybe didn't get him as much publicity. And then you think about their influence, maybe not them personally, but the influence that they had on other lesser known activists who just have a shift in consciousness during this time, and it propels them to do so many more things afterwards.
And to think they're still here, right? Like, you could have a chance, in 1 year, you could maybe see Angela Davis, Elaine Brown, Bobby Seale, you could go and see these folks speaking, the public speaking engagements. And I think, I know that this is part of like a generational cycle, but early, a shift in rap, I mean, without actually going into that too much, but in the late 1980s and early 90s, you're talking about sort of the children of Black Power, and, guess who comes back and becomes a central figure again? Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. So you have like Public Enemy, Fear of a Black Planet. You have a lot of these folks who are very self-consciously, extremely, aware of what they're doing, taking that particular kind of legacy, right? And they're not, no one's trashing Martin Luther King, right? But they're not looking to King. I mean, these are guys who deal with gang members. These guys who, come from, the mean streets, as it were. A lot of kids coming from the ghetto, and that's sort of the people that they identify with. And so you see like a resurgence, even when the group has been defunct, for 10 to 15 years, and really kind of tailspin, right? Like, it became sort of a joke unto itself for a while, I think. And then, a lot of young folks who kind of, this new generational cycle kind of bring that back. So it never really went away. It's still here.
Yeah, and
with us, the legacy.
And in a sense, that also ties with the earlier point that it was never really here, in the sense that as much as the connotation, or like the slogan, or like revolution has come, time to pick up a gun, off the pigs. I mean, it's not like actually were a general threat to overthrow. That wasn't like they were a few weeks or a couple bad breaks away from overthrow, from actually challenging U.S. military or something. But at the point, it speaks to, like, I guess, either Hoover or FBI's institutional paranoia more that drew up the level of, the suppression that was brought to them. But also just the fact that in some ways, became effective, at the time, or I guess I'm talking like about it almost as like Black Panther aesthetic, or the, the styling, the easily identifiable brand that means something and still does speak to a lot of the, then and now economic conditions.
And that aesthetic was part of their very explicit, that they wanted to be the propaganda arm of the revolution. And I read something, and I wish I had reviewed this, but it was something I read in the Black Panther Reader that I have, and it was kind of a critique. Maybe it was just in the introduction or something, but it was kind of a critique of the Black Panthers, and a friendly critique, and that maybe one of the mistakes that the Black Panthers made was that they put too much emphasis on picking up the gun when they themselves recognized that they were not meant to be the Black Liberation Army. They were meant to propagandize, to spread the message, and that the Black Liberation Army, which is a term that comes to be used for kind of like a splinter group that actually does view themselves as, well, just like their namesake, the Black Liberation Army, an actual guerrilla movement. The Black Panthers never saw themselves as a guerrilla movement, and so was it a mistake? The question was raised, I think maybe it was in the introduction to this Black Panther reader. Was it a mistake to pick up the gun when, in fact, they knew that it was going to bring about the extreme response from the state, when in reality, they weren't ready for that. They didn't see themselves as being an army.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think if you want to, I think that creating the style also on some levels, that puts limits and parameters on not only your legacy, but sort of what you're able to do because of sort of the image you've created for yourself. And then I think, towards that end too, is like there are real practical, very practical problems like within the movement right at a time that when women, were making up almost 2/3 of the organization, because so many men are on drugs or going to prison or getting harassed by the cops, that you've already built in this manliness, right? Like, and so what does it mean to be a man? Well, you have to have a gun, right? So if you create that, if you sort of set yourself up to exclude extremely valuable allies, so what about the person who says, well, hey, I don't really necessarily want to pick up a gun, but I want to do what you guys are doing, and I want the same results that you have, or what about women? And a lot of these guys have attitudes. What's the proper role of a woman, right? Is to have babies, right? Because these are going to be the young brothers who are fighting the revolution, and you can see this in movies. Blaxploitation, I think, should not be lumped in with that, but I think that like Sweet Sweetback, I think The Spook Who Sat by the Door, there's actually a few films that are very much of that moment and really trying to actually sort of project a certain kind of the limits of the style. And you see like Sweet Sweetback is just terrible examples that women can only just mother children. So it's like you have to be a man. Well, what does it mean to be a man, right? And you see this in the blues and everything, right? What is it about the Black freedom struggle? Like I want my dignity, but that gets really easily morphed into don't call me boy, I'm a man. What does it mean to be a man? I'm a big tough guy, which is extremely problematic. And that's a big part of the style, right? Is like you're not going to see the movie where when you see that guy in the leather jacket, he's big and he's tough and he's scary, and that's the foil, right? That's what the character is doing there. So there's a problem with creating that kind of image for yourself. It really excludes some people who can really help you out.
Yeah, and weren't there some fairly specific just organizational tensions and explosion of like female members that wanted in terms of access to leadership and things of it? What period were those sort of things occur most intensely?
I guess Jane Brown took over.
She took over in the mid 70s.
Yeah, mid 70s, and
74 maybe.
There was at a time when you could say that the group was sort of flagging. To actually pinpoint when it all goes downhill, I don't know. And she has the tough, part of her legacy is like she comes in and takes over when the organization is really. They've been under attack for 4 or 5 years by the time that she ever gets a chance to sort of be in control. So, and then that also, but you see who emerges out of this, right? Well, like Angela Davis became a pretty damn prominent intellectual, whereas Bobby Seale, people.
He went on to write a cookbook.
Yeah, Elaine Brown as well. Some of the women emerging because they're there seeing these things happen, right? And they're learning the skills and they're developing this kind of frustration, and so they come out with these really poignant critiques, and they don't abandon men either. Angela Davis, why is she writing books about abolishing prisons? To get young black men out of prison. She obviously focuses on gender issues too, but there's certainly not a sense of abandonment, but more of a, if the men were willing to critique were willing to accept the women's internal critique, there would have been much more grounds for at least a more community-based, a more holistic sort of organization.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that one of the things can become too easy to play into like Black Panthers as just the collapse or the failure. I mean, particularly by in terms of groups or academics who might have certain vested interests of like really emphasizing in terms of failure of things. But is that but beyond that, even tendency to focus on like leadership and the few top individuals who, to be fair, in some cases do make pretty exceptional stories. I mean, in terms of with Huey of it, or in terms of or another aspect of it, Eldridge Cleaver, in terms of his whole post-Panthers life and the eventual, in terms of embrace of and being sort of accepted in terms of by the Reagan.
He became a Mooney, I think.
As well, yeah. I mean, it's certainly because of colorful career before and after and during Panther of it. But I mean, focusing on that, or even sort of more kind of individuals who just sort of are not as involved in politics, but life of it does miss, in terms of the thousands of other people who, pointed to some of the names that do go on to have particular influence. So in that case, I mean, it becomes much, trickier to trace, but also sometimes this complicates, what the movement was doing or involved with at its height. I mean, for the people that are going to a particular rally, people who are chanting, in terms of off the picks at that point, are they defined by what the kind of leadership at the time, or within this sort of intense, FBI informant-laden environment of it? How much is it in terms of summed up by the ideology? I mean, I don't know. I suspect that, as with most groups, and perhaps more so even than other kind of direct movements, talking a lot in terms of more with actual people involved would get a lot more of just of a range of what actually mattered to them, or their own sense of, of what we're trying to do with the Little Red Book, or with the 10-point plan, for that matter.
I think some of the the members of the group were really good at this, right? Like, so you have like the mouthpieces, so Huey is constantly sort of writing these tracks, I guess you could call them, or something. I've got a great Huey P. Newton reader, and he covers just this wide variety of topics, like bringing gay liberation, right? He actually addresses some women's issues, but you could sort of critique the way that he does that. So you've got like the mouthpieces, Eldridge Cleaver, right, a prolific sort of writer in his own right. So you've got sort of the mouthpieces. Then you've got like I'd call it like the autobiography craze, right? Like, so many Panthers, like George Jackson is a fairly awesome one, I'd say. But a lot of these guys, write their own story, and then later in the 80s, late 70s, you get Angela Davis and Elaine Brown, whose basically their books are, I would say, critiques of the Panthers. And then you get a renewed academic interest later in the 80s. So you get like this, I'm going to go out and talk to Panthers and see what they said. So, I think in terms of actually thinking about doing history, since this is, AHGS here, and then in terms of doing history, there's these stages of different kinds of documentation that emerge, and so if you were to do a report on the Black Panthers, well, right now you'd have sort of a lot to draw on. You'd have the celebratory to the extremely critical to the I was there, I wish it would have been better kind of critical. So
have you all read the Assata Shakur autobiography? It was about a decade ago when I read it, and I remember really liking it.
Yeah, Melissa's, I've got Elaine Brown, Angela Davis, Assata, like all these, Huey, it's like if I'm thinking about just books that are dedicated to a particular Panther, I've got like 12 of them on my shelf, and then there's a different kind of work that sort of takes a different angle. So it's really became, on some level, it's kind of became this object of study. I would say primarily since the late 80s.
Yeah, and I guess in the other context, there's the level of academia that sort of exists to talk to ourselves and to sell books and other things of it. At the direct level, that we're sort of all TAs, and actually I know that John, I've done the survey 1877 for the past few times. I've done it. Mike, you're
the one I'm doing
Mike,
right
you're doing
now.
it now at this point. I guess thoughts of but also whether since you've also, at high school level, but have taught, I'm presuming sort of time range. Have you, in terms of mentioned the Panthers and in which context? How do you set up? Have noticed things in terms of how students,
predominantly at the high school level.
Right.
And this is my first semester teaching. We had one lecture today, so I can't tell you what it's going to be like in 1877 to the present. But I will say at the high school level, I've got a range of responses. I'm teaching mostly students of color, mostly Latino students, some African American students. I've definitely found that I put a certain glorification on it. I've got there's specific goals I have in mind when I'm teaching about the Black Panthers. The level of analysis. This is high school. I'm dealing with students that are considered at risk, which means a lot of different things. But one of the main things is they hate school and they feel like school, and rightfully so, has never been a place that really spoke to them. And so I try to teach things that speak to them and try to instill some pride and some culture of resistance, right? And so I really try to give a fair shake to the Black Panthers. Nonetheless, a lot of students still are, their reaction is kind of a negative reaction because they see them as unnecessarily violent or wanting to be too confrontational. Nonetheless, there's a lot of students that think they're really rad. Maybe it's the aesthetic, maybe it's the the cool factor, and a lot of them really feel like that that it's like the fact that they're standing up, that they're talking shit to the cops, the fact that they're saying these supposedly outrageous things can be a real draw. So it's actually a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I tend to take, all right, here's the lionized Martin Luther King. Here is the, depending on who you are, most of my students, are suburban ring, I would even hate to, 95% of my students are probably, fairly well-to-do white kids, who haven't really been in a position where they've had to think much about this. And, you still get, I get a bunch of kids who want, tell me it's okay that I like rap, I think that I get a lot of sort of that. So I like to try to hold up the lionized Martin Luther King, the somewhat villainized Malcolm X and Panthers. And then I feel like, poking holes in both of those images, that's sort of the way that, and usually, I'm thinking by that time like this, it seems to be remembered, and I think that this is sort of like the, I always hate to say the popular narrative, because this is a thing that doesn't exist, quite a foil for us historians, but the idea that it's really a choice between violence and non-violence, which just isn't true at all. So I think that, the fact that you've got these two extremely, would seem very contradictory, is kind of fun in the classroom, I think, to use that, poke holes in it, and then by the end have people walking out saying, they really weren't necessarily that different, right? And I guess it's not like you have to pick one or the other, and it's not like the people who were around at that time did pick one or the other, and it's not like people picked violence or non-violence, right? And it's not like if you like Martin Luther King you have to hate Malcolm X or vice versa, right? But you definitely see students who the appeal is there, right? Because where do half of my students, where do they get Malcolm X from? Through rappers from the mid-90s, and that's their idea. So other things have worked to make them cool. So I think that's actually a good way to think about it, Mike, is this coolness factor, which doesn't, necessarily have much weight on what actually happened. So I think that sometimes students are pretty interested just to actually sort of see what happened. And, in terms of putting that into the larger context of the course, I think that all of these groups that we're talking about, say, Panthers to King, they all fit in a long trajectory, right? I don't like the idea of snipping the end off at 1966 and snipping the other end off at 78 or something and saying that's when we remember the Panthers. Although that's the pressures of a course. You got your Panthers week.
I think what might also be maybe more important, maybe not, is the legacy within maybe movement circles today. People who are activists today, and something that comes to mind is, I don't know if you all have ever read Ward Churchill's Pacifism as Pathology, and it's a very interesting critique of sort of pacifism as it's this ideology that's kind of taken over, where it's the only acceptable course of action must be pacifist, and people, always, within progressive movements today, and I see this, people that I like and respect, nonetheless, there's this idea that there's nothing we could possibly ever do that would ever be effective except for MLK, Gandhian, nonviolence.
Inherently good.
And it's a distortion of what the nonviolence really was. If you're looking at nonviolent civil disobedience, it was extremely violent in the sense that you were putting yourself into a violent situation. You were willing, if you were extremely brave, if you were going to be putting yourself into a situation, say what you will about Gandhi, but they, and his followers marched into the sea and getting their heads bashed in. The SNCC activists who are doing sit-ins, they're putting themselves in violent situations. They're taking a risk. And what it seems to happen today is people say, oh, nonviolence, but what they mean is we're not taking any risks. We're keeping ourselves in a safe situation. And this idea that we eschew any sort of conflict, and it's sad. And Ward Churchill, say what you will, there's a lot of problems with what he says. But one of the things he does says is like, hey, actually, violence. People always say violence never works. Violence works for a lot of things. It actually is very
Ask
successful.
The police.
Which could also point into the Panthers with Malcolm X of it, or to the decolonization efforts of it. But I think it's also interesting in some sort of contemporary activist circles that the focus on specific tactics also becomes put in as it's not just as a risk to people involved, but as we don't want to risk alienating public opinion or like being too extreme in this context, which. It usually applies to, like, I think it's a very flawed read in the 1960s. Where I have to point to, it wasn't it wasn't just Black Panthers who were extreme and too much and were going too far, but it was King as well. It was anything that accomplishes a change that actually speaks to broader structural problems that are worth challenging is going to have to be regarded as too radical, as too militant, as crazy, as not in an improper context.
When you're talking about a group, the only way that you can really properly understand their violence is as reactionary. It's not like Panthers were. It would be easy enough for Panthers to just go out and pick out a cop and shoot at them, right? Like this is not. And sometimes that kind of stuff happened, but by and large,
especially early on, they were very disciplined.
And it's not like there's different ways to think about violence. When 99 bullets come in and 2 come out, how violent were you? When you fire the 2 back, right? It's very much reactionary. A great group for Milwaukee, right? It's like you've got the Commandos who are it's like, okay, we're a self-defense group because people are beating these people up, and they were carrying pocket knives and clubs, and if they got a shower of rocks, they'd pick the rocks back up and throw them back out, right? Is that
And they describe themselves as not violent, something like that. We're not non-violent. We're not
going to go out.
Is that
and
what it
attack
was? Something
somebody.
like that, where they self-defense, but we're not.
We're not on
violence.
the attack, but if you hit me, I will hit you back. That's not that's not violence. That's reactionary.
And even
violence,
those who are held up and as proponents of nonviolence, there's an interesting quote I read about that was a Rosa Parks quote where she said, actually, I am not philosophically nonviolent. She actually said this and said, as a tactically, it seemed to make sense, and she was talking specifically about the civil rights movement and Montgomery and then after that, but she was actually putting herself out there to say, look, philosophically, in all situations, no, I'm not nonviolent in all situations. There are many situations where I feel if someone attacks you, you attack them back.
And even so, similarly, we speaking with before, in terms of the range of or diversity of tactics, the range of the different ideologies and approaches and level of confrontation involved. Like the Gandhi in terms of the India movement. It's not just a matter of the saintly figure that was able to so persuade the British that they abruptly realized empire was wrong. It was a matter of mass civil disobedience, mass pressure, and also that the awareness that Gandhi was one aspect of the movement, but there were other people who were much more confrontational that were also putting, threat on it. I mean, I think that's some of the criticisms of pacifism that goes in, like, the usual assumption is that if you're not formed complete nonviolence in all cases, you must be favoring in terms of blowing all things up at all opportunity. Where it becomes more nuanced than this. I mean, the Black Panthers did more certainly in terms of running hospitals, trying to get the ambulance and getting in terms of feeding children and education programs than direct confrontation. But the value of having that aesthetic, even if, as pointed out, John, it gets easily sort of compromised or made sort of ridiculous or made to see not even non-political. Oddly enough.
Do you need a Malcolm X to make Martin Luther King seem reasonable? I mean, in Malcolm X's later years, he went down to, I forget where it was, and I think Martin Luther King was in jail at the time, and he spoke at a church, and he said, "Look," and I'm not going to quote him exactly, but it was something to the extent of like, the people here of wherever they were in Alabama would do good to listen to what Martin Luther King wants, because he's right and because he's nonviolent, and if he doesn't, they're going to have to deal with people like me, and Malcolm X also gets this rap as being violent, and he also, the Nation of Islam was overwhelmingly about social programs and uplifting the black people through culture, through they didn't call themselves black nationalists, but through ownership of their
black
own
capitalism,
black capitalism.
Farrakhan right now is a great neocon.
but I think that worked. It's pretty good as a concluding thought of it as the factor out of time. So this has been your hour of three white dudes talking about Black Panthers, which also speak. We're giving our from grad.
That's another show.
History grad students at UW Milwaukee speaks to other certain structures. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. And should also, if like this at all, check out this coming Monday on John's show, which will be John and Mike's show of it again, 10 p.m. continuing their discussion on music history at the Say It Loud, Random Slabs Music History. So this has been Size of Thoughts, and tune in again sort of next week and regularly Tuesdays at 7 p.m. And if you're in the area, be sure to come by on September 28th to the River West Radio fundraiser, 8 p.m. at Littleman's. Come help support local community radio. Thank you. Good night.
All right.